to the small town of Elmwood, Tennessee. The summer of 1873 brought more than just sweltering heat. Like many other southern towns, Elmwood was nestled between rolling hills and dense forests. Struggling to rebuild after the devastation of the war between the states, here, life moved slowly, its predictable rhythm formed by farm work and Sunday sermons. But predictability was about to become a luxury the townsfolk would desperately miss. Our story begins on a particularly humid July morning when the air hung thick as molasses, and even the roosters seemed too weary to properly announce the dawn. At the edge of town, the modest white clapboard house belonging to the Miller family stood quiet, save for the occasional creak of a rocking chair on the front porch. A widower for 5 years, Thomas Miller sat watching the sun climb over the eastern hills while inside, his 12-year-old daughter, Eleanor, prepared breakfast. Thomas had lost his wife, Margaret, to childbed fever while delivering their second child, a son who survived only 3 days beyond his mother. Since that time, it had just been Thomas and Eleanor finding their way through grief together. As the town's carpenter, Thomas worked a respectable trade that kept food on their table and a roof over their heads. Eleanor had grown into a solemn, thoughtful child who kept mostly to herself, helping her father and tending to their small kitchen garden. By any measure, the Millers weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable enough, and Eleanor never wanted for necessities. She attended the one-room schoolhouse 3 days a week, spending the rest of her time assisting her father or learning domestic skills from Mrs. Abernathy next door. By all accounts, Eleanor was an ordinary girl, quiet, perhaps a bit too serious for her age. With long chestnut hair she kept neatly braided, and eyes so dark they appeared almost black in certain light. What nobody knew, not even Eleanor herself, until that fateful July morning, was that there was nothing ordinary about her at all. Thomas had just taken his last sip of chicory coffee when Eleanor stepped onto the porch, still drying her hands on her apron. For a moment, she stood still, staring at her father with an expression he couldn't quite place. "You all right, Ellie?" he asked, setting down his cup. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked slowly to hearth. They made their way back to the Simmons farm, Zeke carrying Mother Ruth the entire distance. William offered to help, but Zeke refused to relinquish his burden. By the time they reached the farmhouse, Mother Ruth's breathing had grown even more labored. Martha directed Zeke to place the old woman on Eleanor's bed, then shooed the men from the room. With brisk efficiency, she set about making Mother Ruth as comfortable as possible, propping her up with pillows to ease her breathing and placing a cool cloth on her forehead. Eleanor sat beside the bed, holding Mother Ruth's gnarled hand. The old woman's eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on Eleanor's face. "You see now," Mother Ruth whispered, her voice barely audible. "The gift never wrong." "I'm so sorry," Eleanor said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I tried to prevent it." Mother Ruth's lips curved in a faint smile. "Not for prevention, for preparation." She squeezed Eleanor's hand weakly. "I was prepared, ready to go home. But I still need you," Eleanor pleaded. "There's so much more I need to learn. You'll learn your own way now." Mother Ruth's gaze drifted to something beyond Eleanor, something only she could see. "The gift passes to you fully now. Use it wisely." Mother Ruth died as the midday sun reached its peak, January 15th, 1875, just as Eleanor had foreseen. Zeke sat with his grandmother in her final moments, singing softly in a language Eleanor didn't recognize. Martha stood respectfully in the doorway, her earlier prejudice seemingly forgotten in the face of death's solemn dignity. After it was over, William helped Zeke prepare his grandmother's body according to their traditions. Despite the winter ground, the men managed to dig a grave at the edge of the woods where Mother Ruth had gathered her herbs. The small funeral was attended only by the Simmonses, Eleanor, Zeke, and a few members of the freedmen's settlement who had benefited from Mother Ruth's healing skills. In the days that followed, Eleanor retreated into grief once more. She had lost not only a mentor. Lenore leaned close to Alice's ear. "Fight, Alice," she whispered fiercely. "Your time isn't fixed. You can stay if you fight hard enough." Perhaps it was imagination, but Eleanor thought she felt a slight squeeze from Alice's hand. That night, Eleanor hardly slept, her mind filled with concern for the child whose fate seemed balanced on a knife's edge. When she returned the next morning, she found the Perkins household transformed. Alice sat propped up in bed, pale and weak, but alert, sipping broth from a spoon her mother held. "The fever broke just before dawn," Mrs. Perkins explained, joyful tears in her eyes, "and the awful rattle in her chest has eased. It's nothing short of a miracle." Eleanor felt a curious sensation. The whisper that had troubled her for days had fallen silent. January 10th would come and go, and Alice Perkins would live to see many more winters. This experience taught Eleanor that while some deaths were indeed fixed and immutable, others existed in a realm of possibility where human intervention could alter the outcome. The distinction wasn't always clear, but she began to recognize subtle differences in how the whispers presented themselves. The fixed deaths came as certainties, while those that might be averted carried a quality of hesitation or conditionality. With this new understanding came greater responsibility. When Eleanor sensed a death might be prevented, she worked tirelessly to find ways to intervene, sometimes through Zeke's herbal remedies, sometimes by ensuring a doctor was called promptly, sometimes simply by providing better care and nourishment than the afflicted might otherwise receive. Not every intervention succeeded. Some fates remained fixed, despite Eleanor's best efforts. But enough lives were extended, or saved, that word spread of the Miller girl's healing touch, a misattribution that Eleanor never corrected, as it provided cover for her more unexplainable abilities. By 1880, at 19 years of age, Eleanor had become a recognized, if unofficial, auxiliary to Dr. Wilson's practice. The doctor, a pragmatic man concerned more with results than explanations, had come to value Eleanor's inexplicable knack for knowing which cases required his immediate attention and which would resolve with standard care. "Don't know how you do it, Miss Miller," he remarked, after Eleanor had insisted he visit an apparently mild case that turned out to be the early stages of diphtheria. "But I've learned not to question Providence when it works in my favor." In the spring of that year, William Simmons suffered a mild apoplectic fit while working in the fields. Though he recovered sufficiently to manage the farm with hired help, the incident made him and Martha reconsider their future. "And Eleanor's. We're not getting any younger," William told Eleanor one evening as they sat on the porch. "Martha and I have been thinking it might be time to sell the farm, move into something smaller in town." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. She had noticed William's increasing difficulty with physical tasks, Martha's worsening arthritis that made household chores more challenging. "What would you like to do, Eleanor?" Martha asked, joining them with a tray of lemonade. "You're a young woman now with prospects. The Peterson boy has been making eyes at you for months, and he stands to inherit his father's store one day." Eleanor smiled faintly. James Peterson was indeed attentive whenever their paths crossed, and not unattractive with his sandy hair and kind eyes. But the thought of marriage, of binding herself to conventional expectations, felt like a constraint she couldn't accept. "I don't think marriage is my path," she said carefully. "My gift. It demands a certain freedom." William and Martha exchanged glances. "We thought you might say that," William acknowledged, "which is why we have a proposition for you." Their proposal was both practical and generous. The Simmonses would sell most of their farmland but retain the house and surrounding 5 acres. They would move into town, while Eleanor would continue living in the farmhouse, maintaining her independence while having the security of property. "We never had children of our own," Martha explained, her voice unusually emotional. And while we took you in out of family duty, you've become a daughter to us in all the ways that matter. We want to provide for you, ensure you have a place regardless of what path you choose." Eleanor was deeply touched by their offer. "I don't know what to say. You've already done so much for me." "Say you'll accept," William said simply. "Say you'll continue your work, using your gift as you see fit. The world needs more mercy, not less." And so it was arranged. By midsummer, Eleanor had become the sole occupant of the farmhouse where she had lived since her father's death. The Simmons moved into a comfortable cottage in town, close enough for regular visits, but far enough to give Eleanor the privacy her unusual calling required. At 20, Eleanor Miller had established herself as a quiet but essential presence in the community's experience of death and loss. Some still whispered about her strange abilities, her unconventional life as an unmarried woman, living alone. But far more people had come to value her compassionate presence, her unerring knowledge of when death approached, and her gift for easing the transition for both the dying and those left behind. Eleanor's friendship with Zeke had evolved as well. Now in their 20s, they had developed a partnership that bridged their communities, combining her gift for foreseeing death with his knowledge of healing. Though they maintained appropriate public distance due to social conventions of the time, in private they shared a deep bond founded on mutual respect and shared purpose. "We make a good team," Eleanor Miller, Zeke remarked one summer evening as they sat on the porch of her farmhouse at Liberty. That would have scandalized the townspeople, but felt entirely natural to them both. "You know when folks are beyond saving, and I know when they might still be helped." Eleanor nodded, watching lightning bugs illuminate the gathering dusk. "I used to think my gift was nothing but a burden. Now I see it differently." "How so?" Zeke asked, his dark eyes reflecting the last golden light of sunset. "Death isn't the enemy," Eleanor said thoughtfully. "Fear and loneliness are. My gift doesn't prevent death, but it can prevent dying alone and afraid." She turned to look at him. "And your healing doesn't prevent death forever, just postpones it until its proper time." Zeke smiled, the gap between his front teeth visible. "Mother Ruth would say you finally understood the lesson she tried to teach you." "I think about her often," Eleanor admitted. "Wonder what she would think of how I've used the gift." "She'd be proud," Zeke said without hesitation. "As am I." The 1880s brought significant changes to Elmwood and to Eleanor's practice of her gift. The railroad reached their county in 1882, bringing increased commerce, new residents, and more modern ideas. Dr. Wilson retired, replaced by a younger physician with formal training at a medical college in Philadelphia. The new doctor, James Harrison, initially viewed Eleanor's role with skepticism, dismissing what he called country superstitions in favor of scientific approaches. However, after witnessing Eleanor's uncanny accuracy in predicting outcomes and the genuine comfort she provided to patients and families, Dr. Harrison developed a grudging respect for her abilities. By 1885, they had established a working relationship similar to the one Eleanor had shared with Dr. Wilson. She provided insights about which cases were urgent or terminal, while he contributed medical expertise beyond her experiential knowledge. Eleanor's 30th birthday in 1891 arrived with little fanfare but much personal reflection. Nearly 20 years had passed since the whispers first came to her on that July morning in 1873. In that time, she had attended hundreds of deaths, comforted countless grieving families, and occasionally, when fate allowed, helped prevent deaths that weren't yet fixed in time. She had watched Elmwood grow and change, seen children she'd once known become parents themselves. William and Martha Simmons had both passed William in the winter of 1887 from a second, more severe apoplectic fit, Martha the following spring from pneumonia. Eleanor had been with them both at the end, grateful that her gift had allowed her to provide them the same comfort she'd offered so many others. Despite her unusual status as an unmarried woman living alone, Eleanor had earned a place of respect in the community. Young mothers sought her advice on sickly babies, farmers consulted her about ailing livestock, and families increasingly called for her presence alongside the doctor when illness struck. Few now mentioned witchcraft or questioned the source of her insights. Results had spoken louder than superstition. Eleanor's friendship with Zeke remained one of the central relationships in her life, though it remained largely hidden from public view. The racial climate of Tennessee in the late 19th century had improved only marginally, and both understood the dangers of being perceived as too familiar across racial lines. Zeke had married a woman from his settlement, fathered 4 children, and established himself as a respected healer, serving both black and white communities, though the latter often came to him discreetly after other remedies had failed. As Eleanor entered middle age, she began to notice subtle changes in her gift. The whispers came with greater clarity now, often providing more specific information about the circumstances of death. She also found she could sometimes sense impending death from greater distances, occasionally receiving whispers about people in neighboring counties whom she had never met, but whose loved ones would seek her out days later. In the spring of 1900, as a new century dawned, Eleanor faced perhaps the greatest challenge of her gift. A flood devastated the region after weeks of relentless rain, washing away homes, drowning livestock, and leaving many families destitute. The freedmen's settlement, situated on lower ground that white settlers had deemed undesirable, was particularly hard hit. In the aftermath, as Eleanor worked alongside others to provide aid to displaced families, the whispers came with overwhelming frequency and intensity. Dozens of dates, overlapping and insistent, suggesting a coming wave of death beyond anything she had previously experienced. Exhausted and overwhelmed, Eleanor sought out Zeke, now a gray-haired man of 50, with deep lines etching his face. They met at the remains of Mother Ruth's cabin, which Zeke had maintained over the decades as a quiet memorial to his grandmother. "The whispers won't stop," Eleanor confessed, pressing her palms against her temples. "So many dates, so many deaths coming. I don't know how to help them all." Zeke listened intently, his expression grave. "Tell me the dates. All of them you can remember." Eleanor recited the litany of impending death states, stretching from the coming week through the next 3 months, concentrated most heavily in the areas worst affected by flooding. "Typhoid," Zeke concluded grimly. "The floodwaters have contaminated the wells. If people keep drinking from them." He didn't need to finish the thought. Together, they developed a plan. Eleanor would identify which communities were most at risk, based on her whispers, while Zeke would prepare remedies to purify water and treat the early stages of the disease. They would need help, though more hands than just their own. In a bold move that defied decades of careful separation between their work, Eleanor and Zeke approached Dr. Harrison together, presenting their concerns and proposed solutions. The young doctor, initially skeptical about predictions of an epidemic that hadn't yet manifested, was nevertheless impressed by their detailed knowledge and practical suggestions. "I can't endorse folklore remedies," he said after hearing them out, "but contaminated water as a disease vector is established medical science. I'll support efforts to provide clean water and improve sanitation in the affected areas." With the doctor's cautious backing, Eleanor and Zeke mobilized a remarkable cooperation between Elmwood's white community and the freedmen's settlement. Women from both communities worked together, boiling water, preparing food safe for the sick, and distributing Zeke's preventative tonics, discreetly presented to white families as Dr. Harrison's preventative formula. Not all the predicted deaths could be averted. Typhoid claimed victims, despite their best efforts, particularly among the elderly and very young, but the epidemic that might have devastated the region was significantly contained. Dr. Harrison, witnessing the effectiveness of their coordinated response, became a more vocal supporter of both Eleanor's intuitive diagnostic skills and Zeke's complementary herbal approaches. This crisis marked a turning point in Eleanor's life and work. Now in her early 50s, she began actively training younger women in the aspects of her practice that could be taught: the recognition of impending death's physical signs, the comfort measures that eased suffering, the rituals that brought peace to the dying and their families. The supernatural element of her gift couldn't be transferred, but its accumulated wisdom could be shared. As automobiles began to replace horses on Elmwood streets and telephones connected the once isolated community to the wider world, Eleanor adapted her practices while maintaining their essential humanity. She remained a bridge between old ways and new, between superstition and science, between the mysteries of death and the practicalities of grief. In 1918, as the Great War in Europe was drawing to a close, a new threat emerged: the Spanish influenza pandemic that would ultimately claim more lives than the war itself. At 57, Eleanor found herself once again overwhelmed by whispers, dates coming so rapidly she could barely distinguish individual destinies from the collective tragedy unfolding. Unlike the typhoid epidemic nearly 2 decades earlier, this pandemic moved with frightening speed, striking down the young and healthy alongside more vulnerable populations. Eleanor worked tirelessly alongside Dr. Harrison, now himself elderly Zeke, whose movements had slowed with age and rheumatism, and a new generation of caregivers. For the first time, Eleanor found herself wondering if her own death date might be among those she sensed. The whispers had never revealed her own destiny, and she had never sought to know it. But as friends and neighbors succumbed to the virulent illness, she considered the possibility that her long service might be reaching its conclusion. Yet she survived the pandemic, as did Zeke, though both emerged from those terrible months deeply changed. The scale of death had been beyond anything their gifts were designed to address. Individual comfort became impossible when dozens died daily. They had done what they could, focusing their efforts where they might make the most difference. But the experience left them questioning the limitations of their abilities. Perhaps our gifts were meant for a different time, Zeke reflected as they sat together on Eleanor's porch in the spring of 1919. The worst of the pandemic finally behind them. A time when death came more slowly, more personally. Or perhaps they're meant to remind us that, even in mass tragedy, each death remains individual. Eleanor countered. Each soul deserves recognition as it passes. By 1930, Eleanor had reached her 70th year. The girl who had whispered death dates had become an elderly woman herself, her chestnut hair long since turned white, her once straight back now slightly stooped. Yet her dark eyes remained clear and perceptive, and the whispers, though less frequent, continued to guide her to those in need. The Great Depression brought new hardships to Elmwood, as it did to communities across America. Eleanor's simple lifestyle had left her less vulnerable to financial ruin than many, and she shared what she had: food from her garden, firewood from her property, the comfort of her gift that cost nothing but was beyond price. Zeke passed in the winter of 1935, at the age of 85. Eleanor had whispered his date to him months earlier, allowing her oldest friend time to set his affairs in order and say proper goodbyes to his extensive family. She sat with him in his final hours, their hands clasped, as they had been countless times over 6 decades of friendship. "You'll be with Mother Ruth soon," Eleanor told him, as his breathing grew labored. "Tell her I finally understood what she tried to teach me." Zeke's eyes, cloudy with age, but still bright with intelligence, met hers. "She knows, Eleanor. She's always known." His final words were barely audible. "You were never wrong. Not once." After Zeke's passing, Eleanor gradually withdrew from active community involvement, her age and increasing frailty limiting her mobility. Yet, people still came to her farmhouse seeking her wisdom, her comfort, her gift. Young mothers brought feverish children for her assessment. Adult children brought elderly parents for her insights about how much time remained. The bereaved came for her unique understanding of grief's landscape. In 1940, As another world war raged in distant lands, Eleanor celebrated her 80th birthday. The occasion was marked by a steady stream of visitors, descendants of families she had helped over the decades. Young women she had trained in comfort care. Dr. Harrison's son, who had followed his father into medicine and now served as Elmwood's physician, as her strength diminished further. A young nurse named Sarah Jenkins, great-granddaughter of old Mr. Jenkins, whose dog Brutus had been one of Eleanor's earliest whisper experiences, began visiting daily to help with household tasks and personal care. It was to Sarah that Eleanor whispered her own death date in the autumn of 1941, February 17, 1942. She said softly, as the young woman helped her into bed one evening. Sarah paused, understanding immediately the significance of the date. "Are you certain?" Eleanor nodded, a serene smile touching her lips. "I've never been wrong. Not once." In the months that followed, Eleanor put her affairs in order with the same methodical care she had helped others apply to their final arrangements. She wrote letters to those who had mattered most in her long life, recorded the wisdom her gift had taught her, and specified that her modest farmhouse should become a place of refuge for those in need, a clinic of sorts where Sarah and others could continue the work of comfort that had defined Eleanor's existence. As February 1942 arrived, bringing with it bitter cold and deep snow, Eleanor's physical condition deteriorated rapidly. Yet her mind remained clear, her gift intact until the end. In her final days, visitors came, despite the weather. Former patients, neighbors, even descendants of families from the old freedmen's settlement who remembered the white woman who had defied convention to provide comfort to their grandparents and great-grandparents. On the morning of February 17th, Eleanor woke before dawn, feeling the familiar clarity that had accompanied important days throughout her life. Sarah arrived to find her alert and peaceful, sitting up in bed with a small wooden carving of a bird in her hands, Jacob Freeman's gift from nearly 70 years earlier. "It won't be long now," Eleanor told the young nurse. "But before I go, there's something I want you to understand about the gift." For the next hour, as winter light gradually illuminated the bedroom, Eleanor shared final insights about her unique ability, how it had evolved over decades, how it had taught her that death was not an ending but a transition, how it had shown her that compassion was the greatest healing power humans possessed. "The whispers will die with me," she concluded, her voice growing fainter. "But the work continues. Remember that death isn't the enemy. Fear and loneliness are. Whatever your own gifts may be, use them to ensure no one faces either death or grief alone." As midday approached, Eleanor's breathing slowed. Sarah sat beside her, holding her hand as Eleanor had held so many others through the years. With her final breath, the girl who had whispered death dates offered one last message. "Thank you for letting me help." Eleanor Miller died as she had lived, with purpose, with peace, with the absolute certainty that came from a gift she had ultimately recognized as a blessing rather than a burden. She had transformed a frightening ability into a ministry of comfort that spanned nearly 7 decades. Her funeral, held 3 days later, during a brief thaw that allowed for burial, drew mourners from throughout the region, people whose lives had been touched by her unusual gift, whose grief had been eased by her presence, whose understanding of death had been transformed by her wisdom, though no one else inherited Eleanor's specific ability to whisper death dates. Her legacy lived on in the community practices she had established, in the compassionate approaches to death and dying she had modeled, in the stories told about the quiet girl who had known when people would die, and had used that knowledge not to frighten but to comfort in the generations that followed. As medicine advanced and cultural attitudes toward death evolved, Eleanor Miller became something of a local legend in the hills and valleys of Tennessee, the girl who whispered death dates and was never wrong, not once. But to those who had known her, who had witnessed her work firsthand, She remained simply Eleanor, a woman who had transformed an uncanny burden into a lifetime of service, who had faced death without fear so that others might do the same, who had proved that foreknowledge even of life's darkest moments could be the greatest gift of all when used with compassion and wisdom. The small wooden bird, worn smooth by decades of touch, was placed in her hands before the coffin was closed. It was Sarah who thought to do it, a final tribute to the connection that had shaped so much of Eleanor's purpose. The farmhouse, as per Eleanor's wishes, did not stand empty for long, under Sarah's stewardship. And with the modest inheritance Eleanor had carefully managed, it became a quiet sanctuary, a place where the sick could find respite and the grieving could find a moment's peace. It was never a formal hospital, but rather an extension of Eleanor's philosophy, a place where the focus was on comfort, not just cure. The whispers, as Eleanor had predicted, died with her. No one in Elmwood ever again possessed that precise, uncanny foreknowledge, but something else took root in their absence. It was a quieter legacy, woven into the fabric of the town itself. The young women Eleanor had mentored, Sarah Jenkins, chief among them, carried forward the practices she had taught them, the gentle art of sitting vigil, the knowledge of which herbs could ease a restless mind or soothe a fevered brow, the understanding that a person's final moments deserved witness and respect. Dr. Harrison's son, a modern man of science, who had initially viewed Eleanor's methods as charmingly antiquated, found himself incorporating her principles into his own practice. He established one of the county's first hospice protocols, ensuring that those for whom medicine had no more answers were not abandoned to their fear. He often credited Miss Miller's compassion as his inspiration, a nod that bridged the gap between his father's era and his own. In the freedmen's settlement, Zeke's children and grandchildren continued his and his grandmother's work. The knowledge of roots and herbs, passed down through generations, was now shared more openly with the wider community, its value proven time and again. The old suspicions between the two communities never fully vanished, but they were softened by the shared memory of the flood and the typhoid epidemic, of a white woman and a black healer who had worked side by side to stem the tide of death. Years turned into decades. The world changed in ways Eleanor could never have imagined. Wars ended, new ones began. The automobile gave way to more advanced machines, and the quiet of the Tennessee hills was gently pierced by the sounds of a new century. The story of the Whisper Girl slowly faded from everyday conversation, transforming from living memory into local legend. Yet, on occasion, a strange thing would happen. A young mother, sitting with a dying parent, would feel an inexplicable calm settle over her, and know, with sudden certainty, that it was time to let go. A farmer, watching an old dog struggle for breath, would remember a story his grandfather told about a girl and a hound named Brutus, and he would know to sit and wait, offering comfort until the end. It was as if an echo of Eleanor's gift had seeped into the very soil of Elmwood, a residual empathy that manifested in small, quiet moments of clarity. The farmhouse, now known simply as Miller's Place, remained a constant. Sarah Jenkins grew old there herself, training a new generation of nurses and caregivers. She never married, dedicating her life to the work Eleanor had begun. Before she passed, she ensured the property would be held in a trust, its purpose preserved in perpetuity. It became a non-profit respite care home, a place that still, to this day, operates on the simple, profound principle Eleanor had lived by, that no one should have to face death alone. One crisp autumn afternoon, many years later, a young history student from the university in Knoxville visited Elmwood. She was researching Appalachian folk traditions and had come across scattered references in old journals to a woman named Eleanor Miller. She found her way to Miller's Place, now a cheerful, sunlit building with a small staff and a garden where patients could sit. The director, a gentle-voiced woman in her 40s, showed her around, There's not much in the way of official records from her early life, the director explained, but her legacy is in how we operate. We don't just treat illnesses here, we care for people. The student was shown a small display case in the foyer. Inside was the wooden bird carving, a faded photograph of a serious young woman with dark, knowing eyes, and a framed piece of embroidery, stitched by one of Eleanor's first students. It read, "Death is not the enemy. Fear and loneliness are." As the student was leaving, an elderly man was being helped into a rocking chair on the porch. He saw the student looking at the display case and gave a slow, knowing nod. "My great-granddaddy knew her," he said, his voice raspy with age. "Old Mr. Jenkins told my daddy a story about how she sat with him when his dog passed, said she just knew." He looked out over the garden, where the last of the season's flowers clung to their stems. "They say she was never wrong. Not once." The student wrote her thesis, not on the supernatural aspect of the whispers, but on the social history they revealed. How one woman's extraordinary ability fostered a community's capacity for compassion, creating systems of care that outlived her by generations. She argued that Eleanor Miller's true gift was not foresight, but the wisdom to use it to alleviate suffering. Back in Elmwood, the sun set behind the same rolling hills Eleanor had watched as a girl. The old rhythms of life and death continued, as they always would, but the town, in its own quiet way, remembered. In the gentle hands of a nurse, in the quiet presence of a neighbor, in the simple act of not looking away from another's pain. The work of the girl, who whispered death dates, lived on. Her story was no longer just a story. It had become a part of the place itself, a testament to the enduring power of a life lived in service to the most profound of human transitions. She had been, as Zeke once told her, never wrong, and in the end, neither was her belief that even the darkest knowledge could be a vessel for light.